Okay, so trying to get back to the all right, and then let's do screen. I'll do the get Visual Studio going. Do I have it linked? Yes, I do. Mondays, I'm always a little sleepy. So, couple of things real quickly. Do I have the Server Explorer? So the Server Explorer, notice my data connections are gone. This you can do the database things here, but it doesn't actually connect your project to the database. It just connects Visual Studio to your database. So if I right-click over here and add a connection, and I'll do // Express. As I said, this dialog, if you do enough Microsoft stuff, you're going to see this dialog everywhere, wherever you're talking to a database. It's always the same. And it's always a pain because if you click on this or refresh, nothing happens. It takes 30 seconds to time out. I do not know why that would be the case, but it almost never works. I have occasionally, sometimes refresh might be. That's if you changed the server since then. Down here, you should be able to select the database name. So I'm going to select Book Review. Now, again, the assignments are all done in Show Tracker. Book Review is just for the demos. Okay. The other thing I want to show is where your files are. Some of you, not just you, but several people uploaded the solution file, which is useless to me. I can't read anything from it. So I'm going to just do OK. This is not part of any assignment. It's just if you want the database here so you can look at it. Right? That's all it does is let you look at the database. You can actually manipulate the database there. You could add tables. You can add data. I mean, we're not going to do that, but it's really just using Visual Studio to do the things that the Management Studio does. And you can do that. You can also, we're not going to do this right now, but you can actually create a brand new SQL database, SQL Server database right here. You can just create it from this connection, and it will put it in SQL Server. So you can do lots of different things here, but as I said, this is not part of the assignment. It's just that it's nice sometimes to be able to see what columns are in a table. Because you didn't make these databases, I did, so I don't expect you to be particularly familiar with how they're set up. You know, so it can be useful to have these just so you can see. I don't know if that answered your question, probably more than you wanted. Okay, and again, that's in the Server Explorer. And again, that's just using Visual Studio as your, instead of SQL Management Studio. Almost everything you can do in SQL Server, you can do in SQL Management Studio, or in Visual Studios. My brain is gone. Everything you can do in the Management Studio, you can also do in Visual Studio. In fact, if some of you may have noticed that when you're installing SQL Server, if you have Visual Studio installed, a lot of times it will not install the Management Studio because it thinks you've already got a front end, right? I prefer the Management Studio for some things. Okay, other questions? I know you're not done with the service. Right. Actually, I'm going to open it. So I'm going to open up service example. And this is, again, just the example, and it's a lot less. I did a lot less stuff than what's asked for in your service. And one reason I'm going to open this is that the way we've done this, I'm going to have to run it and then open a new copy of Visual Studio. So we built this using basically the internet, the IIS, I'm trying now, why am I having trouble remembering that too? Internet something Explorer, or Internet Service, Internet something service. What is the second I?
Information.
Information Service, thank you. Brain is gone. So we did that with the local one. So it's just local to this machine. There is in the files of your Canvas, there's a document about how to set this up in the real IIS. I didn't do that for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it makes it harder for you to transport these things around, because once it's in IIS, it doesn't move, right? It would be really hard to put it on your thumb drive, take it home, and run it again. You'd have to reconfigure it into IIS. So it's a lot harder to move it. On the other hand, it saves you some awkwardness, like I'm going to have to run this to do the client. So I'm going to have 2 copies of Visual Studio running, and that's kind of awkward. If it's in IIS, you just call it like a web page, and it wouldn't, which is more realistic too. So we might do one that way. It means we'd have to configure IIS on these, which can be an issue. All right, the other thing, are there any, just a real quickie review, because it's been 4 days, right, or however long enough to forget everything. Okay. So we did the ADO, right? So the ADO ties it to the database. It's that wizard that creates all the classes that match the tables that you have in the diagram. So if you look, the one that's a diagram is the EDMX. So we did 3 tables. We did author, book, and author book, right? It doesn't show the linking table. It only shows these many-to-many relations, and it will resolve it for you by creating basically an array of authors that goes with books and an array of books that goes with authors. How it does it isn't super important right now, but it understands your IntelliSense. And one of the things when you're doing those queries, so let's go back. When you're doing those queries, that's not where I want to go. Book review service. Like these var things. Use your IntelliSense. Sometimes you can do, and I don't know if I showed this. So we've got br.authors. If we wanted to get to the book here, I could do well, I'm in the wrong place. Let me do it in the parens. Just do a comma there. I'm not going to add this. I'm just going to show. Notice that it has author name. It also has books. So I could actually get to the book titles if I wanted. I'd probably have to, for this one, do from be in a.books. And then I could do b.book title. I don't know how to explain all this to you except to use the IntelliSense. You know, and you can kind of figure out what you can get to. I'm going to get rid of that because we really don't want that there. I just wanted to show you there's that. And then if we go down to the other one, we've got A in authors, B. So we can get the author name that way. I don't have a good example here of one of the ones in the venue one where you're doing the venue and you want the venue name. You can go show. So S, if you had S for show, venue name. Right? You don't have to do a second from for that one. Does that make sense? Try the IntelliSense here. The syntax of this will sort of start to make sense to you as you use it. As I said, it's an upside down SQL statement. But it gets, like in an SQL statement, you can't have two froms, right? But the dots, after you do the object in the dot, it'll give you a feeling of what you can get to. If it's a plural here, that means that's the end, right? You can't get to the thing. If it's a singular, like in s.venue, then that means you can do dot and it'll have all the fields for venue. I know that won't stick too much, but use the IntelliSense and see what you can get to. All right. The other thing I want to just a quickie review is, so we have every service. So we have the data connections. Every service has an interface and then the actual code for the service. The interface is what it shares with the client, which we're going to build in about a second. It says when we make a reference to this service, it says I have two methods here. And the first method returns a string, a list of strings, and it's called getAuthors. And you don't have to pass it any parameters. It just returns a list of strings. Here, this one returns a list of booklight objects, and it takes an author as a string. So it tells the client, I've got these two methods, and this is what they look like, and this is what they return, right? The client needs to know that if it's going to use these methods. Does that make sense? We also have, and we didn't have to do this, but because I'm not, sometimes it's easier to generate your own little class, because the classes that the ADO entities makes are exact matches of the database tables. But sometimes that's not exactly what you want to pass back and forth. You don't need all the fields. Or you want to mix fields from two tables into one object, right? Because database tables don't necessarily map well to real objects. So you can make your own data contracts just to make your life easier. It may feel like it's making your life harder, but the goal is to make your life easier if you do that. You don't always have to do this. Sometimes the database table field is perfectly fine, right? The database table class that it made for you. Okay. Any questions about the general? And again, most of this code in here, you're welcome to look through it. There are things you can do with it. I did list some tutorials, I think, somewhere. If not, I will, that go along with this. There are tutorials on particularly MSDN, which is the Microsoft documentation site. Some of them are like 70, 80 pages long. They're even longer than mine. A lot of them start by having you build the database in code from scratch, which we're not doing. But yeah.
Oh, it doesn't take too much time. I'm just wondering on that interface file.
Sure.
Where we made the flight class.
Right.
And we have the public string title and hidden set and bracket.
Right.
How's that work?
All right. So, do you know? I'm going to type this here, but typically, if we were to do, I'm going to do private string author, and I'm not going to make it a thing. I'm going to right click on here, refactor, encapsulate field, do OK, apply. So normally, this is the full syntax for something like that. Normally, you have an underlying variable, a field. They call it a field because it's descriptive of the class. Usually, you make it private. Then you create a property which has a get, which allows you to see the author, and a set that allows you to change the value that the author is storing as a variable. This is true. Now, other languages do this exact same thing. They just don't have this part. But they create gets and sets for every field. It's part of object-oriented. You create your private fields, and then you create gets and sets to reveal them as you wish, right? Because not everything needs to be public. So what this line does is exactly the same thing as a shortcut. Does that help?
Yeah.
And only Microsoft has that shortcut. It's kind of neat, but it is a little cryptic. Other languages, you have to fully write out the sets and gets. If you're in Java, and in you can right-click on a variable, and it'll create a get and set for you, just automatically. It's a shortcut, probably a bad habit, but. Other questions? So I'm going to run this. A couple of things about it too. I think I mentioned before. The service has to match the interface exactly. So it has to, the method signatures in the actual service have to be exactly the same as this. So if you change something over here, you got to change it over there. If you change something over there, you got to change it in the thing. They have to match exactly. So I'm going to go back to the service and run it. And these things only run if you're in the service file. Otherwise, you get an illegal web page. Basically, a web page saying you're trying to open something you have no permission to open. Okay, so I don't need to run the actual methods here. Do you guys need any refresher on the testing? I mean, basically, you just double click. This, it always warns you. And then this one will give me a list of the authors. The other one takes an author's name. Anybody remember an author's name? What?
Brian Green.
Oh, Brian Green. Okay. And that was with an I, Brian.
Yeah.
So you have to type that name into the value up here. And if you have multiple values, like what later we're going to do inserts, where you insert in through a form, you might have multiple parameters here. And then when I do invoke, okay, so it actually worked. Notice there's a 0 here and a little triangle. If you touch that triangle, it'll open up and give you the content of that object. This is a booklight object, has an interdate, ISBN, and title. And we've matched it to Brian Green as the author. The 0 is its index number, right? You know how arrays work. So 0 is its index number.
You know why I wouldn't be able to find value?
Which one are you running?
Get authors. Should we get books?
Yeah, get books, because there is no input, there's no parameter for get authors. All right, so I could leave it matter. I'm going to I'll minimize it in a moment, but right now I'm going to start the client, and I don't want to. This is so. Here's the good news, I guess, in a way too. Once you've done the service part of this, the client side is easy, right? All the work is on the service side. So I'm going to right-click on this, and I'm going to open another Visual Studio 2013. So if you right-click on the icon, this is running, and then I'm going to open a second Visual Studio. And I think I'm going to minimize that Visual Studio. Oh, come on, move. There we go. Maybe down a hair. The client app. So you guys remember, this is, I said, there are lots of leaps here from probably the coding classes you've had before. So if you're uncomfortable and a little bit panicked, don't panic. It takes a while to get this. So we have our server, that pin is useless. And then we're going to create a web page that talks to that service and then goes through the service to the database. So this one is just going to, it's still going to be a new website. It's still going to be empty for doing empty websites. I'm going to call it, what did I call the other one? Service example? So let's call it service example client. Again, you could call it whatever you want. So I'm going to do OK. And my client is going to be simpler than yours, and a couple of other things. Most of you won't be ready for the client today, but if you do get there, I don't care how you can be as ugly as it needs to be. Basically, you're just going to have a series of drop-down boxes and a couple of data grids. So don't, you can, if you want to make it pretty, you can. Ultimately, there's a project at the end, and that's kind of where you can put it all together and maybe make something pretty. So I'm going to right-click here. And this is a little bit, so I could add a web page right now, but what I want to add is a service reference. Oh, is that one other thing I forgot to do, but we can do it right now. I'll add the service, start that, add service reference. We need the address of our service. And it is running down here. Do you see that little, probably can't see it, but there's a little says C:// little console thing. If you click on that, it'll pop up the service that's running. And what address we need is the one right here, localhost. Mine says 1397. You might have a different number. It kind of generates for you automatically. If we had done it on IIS, we would have an actual URL to talk to. But I'm going to copy the address. So I clicked on that, right-clicked, copy address. Going to minimize it again. And I'm going to paste that address into add service reference. I'm going to do go. And it's, notice it says author book service. And if I click on that, it shows me my two methods, get authors, get books. So that's all, we just have to make that. We need to give it a name. I'm going to call it book review service reference, which is long, but that's okay. Now you could just click OK here. This you do not have to do. I'm going to do advanced. I'm just curious what's in there. Yeah, we can ignore that. So I'm going to do just OK. And it adds some stuff over here. Right, it adds app web reference, book review, service reference. And if you're really curious, if you go into those, there are parts of things that are in there that we can ignore, but mostly they're XML files. That didn't open, but that's okay. Yeah, there it goes. This is the kind of XML that it generates for you and things. You can generate all this by hand. I'm not going to go into any of that, though. So I just want you to know that most of what it generates are XML. If you were doing RISC rather than the XML, it would generate jQuery, or not jQuery, JSON stuff for you. I will play with that maybe and show you at some point. I'm less comfortable with that. but it actually is more common these days. So I'm going to do add again, and this time I'm just going to add a web form, and default is fine. So we have the service. We've linked to that service that has those methods. And now we have our web page. This one actually is the web page. It will display it, right? And I'm going to make it as ugly and fast as I can. In real life, when you're building these, you want them to be pretty and useful. I'm just showing the functionality. For what it's worth, even when I try to make them pretty and useful, they usually aren't. You guys are probably much better at that than I am. So I'm going to bring, this is just like the one we did with ADO, right? So I'm going to bring a drop-down list, and we could, if we want, name it like drop-down list author, whatever makes sense to you. I'm going to minimize that. And I'm going to add grid view, which is down under data. So if you don't have data, you just scroll down until you see data, and there's grid view. And again, it just renders as a simple table. And I could name this book grid view books or something. You know what would be really useful, and something I've never done, is to develop a good naming convention. I've played with lots of different naming conventions, and none of them are very good. So, but it really helps if you have a good naming convention for things. There are some, Microsoft has certain naming conventions, and I usually follow it for the code, but it's a little bit weirder in the XML stuff for that. So, as I said, this is really minimal web page. And I could apply, just like we applied CSS before and stuff, I could make all sorts of different things to it, but I'm not going to. Kind of like before, I am going to click on the drop-down list, and this little tiny arrow, which you probably can't see from the back, it's a little greater than sign. It's a smart tag, and it does a couple of things. One of them is it enables auto postback. So I want to do that. The other option is to create a button on here, which you could do. Then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double click it, which creates a drop-down list author selected index changed method. So again, I double click the drop-down list. If you don't double click the drop-down list, then what you have to do is go in there and add this attribute. And then go to the code and create a method that's at that attribute. So if you don't double clicking it does it for you. If you don't double click it in the designer, it has to be in the designer. Then you have to type it in both places. One advantage of typing it in both places, so that you don't have to name it this, you can name it whatever. So, all right. Are we okay so far? So we have a drop-down list, and we have the grid. I am going to make, remember how we had to connect to the ADO stuff? We have to connect to our service too. So our service, what did I name my service? Is it book review? Book review service reference. I'm going to call that book review BRSF. Does that sound good? Equals new, not mu, book review service reference. What is it not like there? Do I need to do one more dot? Oh yeah, author book client. So let's change this to ABSC. I can't do that. AB. Actually, just call it DB, database reference. So here I need to also do the dot author book service client. And I'm going to break that line so you can see it all. So we need to, within the book review service reference, we need to get to the author book service client. Yours might be named different. If you did this with me and you named yours differently, then it might be, it could be different. And if you don't have this, I guess just watch it afterwards to show you. So this is just, book review, service reference, dot, and this is the part that we really need, author book review, author book service client. Luckily, we only have to refer to it as DB from now on. So I'm going to create a method to load the drop-down list. I'll just call it load drop-down. And this is going to actually be pretty easy. Now I think what I have to do, this is a little bit weird, but I think I want string authors equals db dot, and we should get authors. We did it as a list in the other side, but I have found that it wants it as just a regular string array over here. And I have no idea why it changes it from a list to an array. But for practice, I know that it does that. This is all we have to do, except now just say drop down list author dot data source equals authors. And because there's only one field, I don't have to do that. Drop down list author dot data bind. And then I'm going to call that load dropdown from the page load. I could have written that in the page load, but I think it's a better habit not to. I'm going to run it just to see if it works. And there's our authors. So, I mean, all that coding we did on the other side, easy on this side. Now, no matter what I choose, it's always going to go to Brian Green. Anybody know why? Do you remember? It's the same as when we did it with the ADL. We need to make it so that it only refreshes the list the first time it loads. Okay, so again, what it talks about, the very first time it loads is not considered a post back, but every time after that it goes back to the server. and it redraws the page. This is saying don't redraw this control except the first time. And that way it'll keep, and the way that it handles that is it actually stores it in a hidden field, or goes back to the server and then reasserts the order after that. Right. Does that make sense, sort of? Yeah.
I'm getting a weird error that's not actually showing up. It's just the red dot on the side, but there's no blue line, and it's not letting me run it.
What kind of, does it have anything in your area list?
Where's the red line?
Oh, you know what? You're missing a area list.
Oh, really? Weird. Oh, it still says there's no error.
Maybe look, see what the error is. Does it have an error, actual error message this time? I'll look in a minute, because we're on there now. All right, so in the drop down, in this method, and again, it's probably better practice to create a new method. Protected void fill grid. The reason why it's a better, it doesn't really matter here, but if you ever have to call this more than once, calling this is an impossibility. It's just a pain, because you have to provide the sender and the event arguments, and that's just crazy. So it's better just to do this, and then you can call your method and not have those parameters to worry about. So the grid, I'm just going to do, so I need to create a, I think it's still, does it work? Let's try this. So I'm going to do db dot, oops, that didn't work. Why is it not giving me that? Oh, I know why. It's book service, book review service reference dot booklight equals db dot get books. And before we do this, we actually also have to get the selected string equals drop down list author dot selected dot text. So we get whatever the selected text is, and then we put author here. Now, does that cure it? So it doesn't like that, so we may have to convert this to and that. Oh, and I need to give it a name. So again, I had to convert it to an array, but it's an array of this kind of object. And this gets the author from the drop-down list, whatever one is selected. And then we just have to say grid view books dot data source equals books and grid view books dot data bind. Again, just a minimal amount of code on this side. And then I call that fill grid from the event, the select index changed. So we call the method, pass it the author name, and so the service is doing all the work, right? All the work, all we have to do is call the service, call the method, make sure we give it what it wants, which is an author's name, and then get the return, which in this case will be an array of booklet. So let's see if that works. I'm still running. So I'm going to run. So one of the problems with the way we're doing this is I have to actually select Brian Greene. And that didn't do anything because the index didn't change. So if I go down to David Foster Wallace, I can get Infinite Jest. And now if I go to Brian Greene, it'll go there. It's because the index hadn't changed and the event is select index changed. So you might put something at the top of the list that is like choose book or something so that the index always changes. I could show you how to do that. Okay, so it's working. So the client, as you see, is actually really simple. Let's see if I can add something at the top of the list. This is extra. Now I think the way it is right now, that'll come. No, there's no. I want to add it at index 0. I've done this before. It's been a while though. Text change, text. Let's see if that does it. So I said I'm going to insert an item at index 0. I'm just curious if that does it. Choose a book, or actually I should say choose an author. But then, so you always have to choose something. Let's make it choose an author. Okay, so when you finish your service, the good news is that the client is a lot easier. Okay. All right, so the last thing I want to do is I think just show you how to move this to GitHub. All right, so I have 2 copies, as I said, of Visual Studio running too. I think I just, and you'll have to have the service running, at the same time. So I'm just going to close these real quick. You don't have to close them to move them to GitHub, but yes, I'm still debugging. I'm going to open up the Windows client, which is here. Now, I don't know if I've logged into this or not. So I have, I wonder if you can re-log in. Oh, no, log in. So it wants me to log in. All right, so one of the first things you have to do is you have to have a GitHub account to use the window, right? And if you don't have an account, it does have a link here to go to GitHub to create an account. So I'm just going to SP-Conger and hope that that's my password. So I don't have any local repositories, which is fine. So I'm going to head over to the dashboard, and I'm going to create a local repository. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to, what was the first, the service was just service example. So I'm going to call it just service example. All right, so I'm going to create the repository. And there's nothing in it right now except git attributes and git ignore. There's a command line way to initialize this too, but we'll just do that. So what I'm going to do, and as I said, this is just doing it all GUI, but if you go to your documents folder, you should now have, once you've created a repository, it won't be there until you've created at least one repository, but you'll have a GitHub folder in my documents, in documents. When I open that, there's service example, one I just made. So what I'm going to do is basically go back to Visual Studio 2013, websites, service example. I'm going to open that. Going to just copy all those files. Again, there's ways you can move them without much more efficiently, but, and then I'm going to go back to the GitHub. Service example, I'm just going to paste it in there. I'll show you, there is a link to GitHub directly in Visual Studio, but it usually objects to how hierarchical our file structure is. And I'm not sure why, because GitHub itself doesn't have any problem with it. All right, so these are in the GitHub repository. I go back to the GitHub, and okay, so I want to service example. I want to commit it. I forget if I remember. Do I do compare? No. Come on, give me the changes. That's what it is. I have to go to changes. See, it has all my files there. I have to commit it. So I have to give it a commit statement. This could be anything, but I'm just going to say commit. You don't even have to use the word commit, but I do. Service example. And I'm going to put the date on it, sort of 2/1/2016, although it will actually have a date. You can give it a description if you want. And then I'm going to commit it to the master. And then if I go back to history, all my files are there. So changes are what history is to files. And then to put it on the website, I'm just going to do publish. I can give it a description if I want. I'm just going to publish service example. And if I go to the web page, github.com, and mine is spconger. So, and if I look at repositories, come on, there's service example, updated 1 minute, and there are all the files. And this actually is a good enough link to give me for the assignment. I'm going to do this again because I'm going to do the client too. All right, so I'll go through that process again. And if you open, like the app code here, if I double click the app code, it usually will open. Is it not done? There we go. And then you can look and you can see the code. These are nicer than the zips, but the zips work too if you zip the whole thing. Because I can look at all this and it's, yeah. What? Yeah. Do you guys not have it in the virtual?
No. You say once you
So if it's not there, try going to the here and see if GitHub is there.
okay, I tried that out.
So I'm going to add a new repository for the example service client. I'm going to create the repository. Then just using the file system, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, just get all these files. I take them all because then if you zip it and download it, it runs, right? If you don't take all of them, then, which you don't have to, you could just take your code files. So I think I copied it. Go back to GitHub service client, paste. Come here and go to changes, do a commit. Again, you can put whatever makes sense to you here. I've actually seen people that are really good at writing commits that when they look at them, they know what it is. These are more important. These you have to do the commit. But these are much more important in naming and stuff when you have multiple people working on the same document, because that's one of the things that GitHub will allow, is it'll allow multiple people to work on a document and it'll record the changes that go up. So each separate commit, you can look and you can see what has changed from the previous. It's actually quite nice. I'm going to commit to master, go to history, it's just they're all there now, and then publish. And again, you can give it a description, which but I'm just going to publish. And if I go to GitHub now, let's go back just to spconger. I don't know it, so I go to the There's example, and there's the code that I just wrote. It also is good for you because you can go look at my code there. But does that make sense? I mean, this is one way. There's also, I think there's a way to create a new branch, and we're not going to do that. Pull requests. You can pull, you can clone, you can copy things. There is a tutorial down here. And as I said, if you really prefer shell that you can use. You can also get a bash shell, this same PowerShell. Okay, the rest of the time is open lab, I think. I'll come around, give me a second to close things down, and then I'll. One sec. I just want to close this down and particularly stop the video